And good afternoon. It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming to listen to us. We live in times of great change, social, political, technological. Museums, on the other hand, have traditionally been spaces that reflect on our history, that mirror the slow passage of time, that really represent continuity. And the very idea of the museum, as it was once conceived, is being challenged in different locations, different contexts. What we think of today is already yesterday. And technology and a host of other factors are forcing us to rethink, to reframe, to renew. And how do we, as museum professionals, respond to that? How do we reimagine our spaces so that they are still relevant to our audiences and to their changing needs? So today in our discussion, Museums as Incubators, we will look at two main narratives. In the first section, we will look at we will examine this whole idea of the museum as an incubator of training, of mentorship, of cultural leadership. How do museums work as creative hotshops for young professionals? How are they exposed to new ideas, to different approaches, and to the wealth of experience that their senior colleagues are able to share with them? And in some parts of the world, that's the only learning they're going to receive, because these are regions that may be rich in art and culture, but the arts educational infrastructure is fragmentary. And in our second narrative, we are really exploring the museum and how it's evolving in this whole climate of change. How can museums be incubators of ideas, of dialogue, become sites of protest, of social activism, of intercultural learning, spaces of care and mental well-being? We have a brilliant group of panelists here, each of whom has really made a significant impact in their areas of work and beyond. So I'm going to plunge right in so you can hear from them directly. And since our panel discussion is located in India, I'm going to use that as our starting point, really, and begin with you, Tasneem. Because in India, over the years, museum professionals have struggled with infrastructure both within and very little in terms of formal educational infrastructure. But instead of lamenting over this, there are some organizations that have really stepped up to the plate, like the Bhau Daji Lad, and filled in some of these gaps. So I really want you to talk about the initiatives that you introduced and how they can be replicated perhaps in other institutions.
So, good morning, friends. Please bear with me. The Delhi pollution has got to my throat. So I hope that it's not going to be too difficult to decipher what I'm saying. But yes, for those of you who don't know the museum, it's the oldest museum in Mumbai. It was established in 1857. It's also one of the oldest museums in Asia. When I came to it in the late 90s, it was seen as a colonial relic, and it was completely neglected. It was in a derelict condition. And it's a beautiful museum. For those of you who haven't seen it, please go on the website. Please visit us. It's what is called a jewel box museum. And so there were people running it who really had no sense of what a museum is and what the potential of a museum is. And when I took over the project, I restored the museum. I did the fundraising. It was a greenfield project. I also had to train staff, bring in new people, all the old people who were from the government who were there. We tried very hard to convince them to stay, but they didn't. They wanted to be part of a government setup. They're very suspicious of this new private organization that was coming in. It was a public-private partnership. And so I had to bring in all new staff, completely from the sort of security person to the curators, and train them. Now, I have to say that I was a docent at the Met when I was at college in the US. And that was my only experience of museums. But I was so passionate about it and I was so determined to make this an example of what other museums in India could emulate. So I read the ICOM book on museums. That was my training, really. And I worked very closely with the V&A because we are the erstwhile V&A in Mumbai, actually the older V&A, the elder sister of the V&A. And I worked very closely with the V&A to implement a lot of the programs. But literally, I wrote the HRD document, I wrote the acquisitions policy, the operations guideline, etc., Googling, looking, asking questions. And with me, there were these young people who were also infused with the same passion, the same interest in museums. And we have trained I can't even say how many young people have worked with us. This is now going 20 years. And I'm very proud to say that 4 of the young people who started with me, one of them worked with me for 10 years and is now a senior curator at the Louvre Abu Dhabi. The other one is a director of the Indian Museum Experience in Bangalore. Another young woman is the director of the Jahangir Nicholson Foundation at the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai. And the 4th one has just taken over as the curator of the Prameya Foundation, which has just taken a space in Mumbai. So 4 young people started with me, have gone on to lead institutions, which is a very gratifying thing. I think it's about relationships with the young people that you have, giving them a lot of autonomy, a lot of independence, encouraging them, sending them for a lot of skilling programs. So a lot of the young people who worked with me, Himanshu, for example, went to the MoMA in New York for their curators program. He went to Mönchengladbach. These are all associations that I tried to sort of forge with other institutions and build on that skill development. Of course, we also have a skill development program with the V&A. And my young curator who works with me right now went on the Nehru Fellowship to the V&A. So there's an active effort to get them to think at a larger level, to expose them to different kinds of practices. So that's really working with the institutional staff, but there's also a whole program that we have of training the young staff in the State Museum across the state. There are many of them who have never had any exposure, who don't understand curation. They don't understand design and display. They don't understand presentation. So working with them, doing workshops, we've done several workshops for them, sharing expertise with them. We are working with the Mumbai police, for example. They're setting up a museum, and they came to us and they said, would you help us and would you train our people? Because we don't know how to set them. And so we take on those kinds of initiatives. We also engage docents, interns, and we're engaged, of course, across the board with schools, with the CAS education program where they come in and do projects. The idea is to develop a passion and a love for the museum. So the latest wonderful initiative that I want to share with you that we've just started is we have a little reading room for 2-year-olds, 2 to 3-year-olds. And we have books, and parents can bring their children in and read to them. And then once a week, we have a resource coming, and we have the resource engages with them. The idea is that right from childhood, from age 2, you develop a love and a passion for museum and for art. And I think that is really what is at the core of performance and of progress.
It's great to hear all the things that you've done, Tasneem, and especially the curatorial studies program that they introduced. I really want, because there is no formal pedagogy for anyone who wants to do curatorial studies in India. So unless you can afford to go abroad and study, there is no formal training. And the Bhau Daji Lad introduced a whole short course on that.
So we have a one-year diploma, postgraduate diploma, and modern and contemporary art history and curatorial studies. And it was because there was such a dearth of any exposure to curatorial practice that there was such a strong need, and the students were asking us that we introduced it. It's a brief segment of the course. But we've had 25 students every year over a period of 9 years. We had to close because of COVID, and then we were undergoing repairs, and so we're going to start again. But I've had students come to me and say, the course has changed our life. This was something we always wanted to do, and we couldn't find a place where we could study or gain knowledge on these subjects. And so that really has contributed to building the ecosystem in the arts. And it's not just in Mumbai, it's across the country, because these people have gone on to get jobs in various places or in various not institutions, galleries, but also gone on to further studies.
Thanks, Tasneem. Naomi, you have such a rich museum background from your early years in the Studio Museum in Harlem, which was set up really to celebrate the work of artists of African descent, and I'm sure to nurture young professionals as well, who then went on to build great careers in museums. So I really wanted you to talk about the mentorship that you received in Harlem, and also how did working in the whole museum ecosystem actually help you to acquire skills that you need not necessarily acquire in a school, but are really invaluable education.
Thank you for that. And first of all, before I speak, hello everyone, and I want to thank the fair and all the organizers of the talk series for having me here today to talk about my career, my work, etc. And thank you, of course, for that question. I really want to echo something that you said, Tasneem, which is that a job is a vocation, and a vocation requires training. And one of the things that I learned very early on at the Studio Museum is that work is its own form of pedagogy. That you can make a curriculum of the work that you've been doing, and that a formal education doesn't necessarily have to precede all the work that is possible inside of your career. I apologize for these blurry images. They're not coming out very clear, but you'll see some images of an exhibition I've done at the Studio Museum behind me. There were two things that were important for the Studio Museum. It was guided by Thelma Golden, the incredible now still director who is about to reopen the museum this year with a brand new building, and someone who was very particular about doing two things. One, incubating talent. You're very right. Many people have come through that museum and come through the museum with the knowledge that this may not be our home forever. I think in many sort of larger scale museums around the States, especially the more famous ones, people really think that this is their last stop, their last job, last career move. And it was very clear at the Studio Museum that this was one place where we could be in our careers. So that sense that our work was always part of an education that we had to take everywhere else was important. The second thing was always the question of what does it mean to advocate for artists of African descent? And there are many ways to do that, but we always understood our work as a kind of activist bent. Now, that does not mean we were out sort of raising our fists and barking every day, but we knew that we had to make projects and programs that allowed the artists that we showed to become permanent parts of art history. It was about not just incubating our museum, but really incubating the field of art history. So the United States, of course, has a sizable population of black people. And these black people are, in many ways, we black people, I should say, are part of the culture. We have been there for 400 years. But we're also understood as being a part of the culture, distinct and different from the culture. So occupying a space of being wholly inside of a culture but also outside of a culture has been the way that African American cultural history and art history has been framed, as something apart from the larger narrative of Western art history. And so we realized that our job was to really integrate that story of black cultural production into the larger story of American art history. And there are certain things that American art history values. It values expression. It values painting. It values the idea of the single genius, mostly a white man by himself in a studio. And so I understood that my job, and my colleagues at the Studio Museum understood that our job was that we had to introduce what felt for us as black cultural values as part of the canon of art history. So that became then the story of collective practice, working in community. That became the story of a kind of craft tradition that was, again, a deep part of aesthetic thinking. This became the story of working outside of a traditional studio, going into the streets, the fields, collecting objects, transforming materials. These are the kind of values and practices that then I brought into my curatorial practice that became part of the art historical narrative that I continue to tell to this very day. So the core of, I think, my thinking is to not just bring more black voices into exhibitions, especially into majority museums, into projects globally, because that has been done, right? There have been plenty of exhibitions starting in the 50s and the 60s in the US where you're seeing black artists come into museum spaces, but then they disappear. And so I realized that we can't just bring these sort of othered bodies into a larger majority context. We actually have to bring new frameworks, new vocabularies, and new art histories into those majority frameworks. And that has been the ongoing project.
Thank you so much for so eloquently putting how so many of us in the present context, learning and relearning language, narrative, how we frame our stories. So Ferran, I wanted you to share your experience where you interned at the new museum under the incredible Marsha Tucker, and how that impacted you, as well as in later leadership, when you played leadership roles, both at Santa Monica in Barcelona, you were experimenting so much, and at CA2M in Madrid. So what was the kind of ecosystem that was provided to young professionals as they came in here into these spaces?
Well, thanks so much. First of all, also I want to express my gratitude for bringing me here, to all of you, to the fair. It's a pleasure to be with these great co-speakers tonight. When we started talking about this idea of museum as incubator, I thought, okay, I owe so much to museums that were incubators. My first experience, I don't know if it's the first picture here. No, it's not. Okay. As you were saying, my first experience was at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. In the mid-90s, I was an unpaid intern at that moment, and remember very well my very first day.
Hold your mic like this so it's clearer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, angle the mic, yeah.
Okay.
Like a rock star.
Mm-hmm. But, if we can move forward to an image a bit more, please, until, you'll discover which one I'm saying, because you'll see me very young. No. No, just go ahead. A bit more. Maybe it's the last one. Here. Okay. Yeah. Isn't it cute? Okay. That's Marsha Tucker. I remember arriving the first day at the museum, and she was really busy. And I was going to intern directly with her at her office. So she told me, as I arrived 9 a.m. on a January day in 1995, she told me, oh no, just sit in my desk and browse everything, look at everything. I want you to know everything I'm doing. So my first experience in a museum was sitting in the director's chair. Mm-hmm. And that's once you sit there, you discover, okay, I mean, this is a great seat. Marsha was a great mentor. I mean, it was not especially generous with me. She was. But she was very generous with a whole generation of young people, curators, non-curators, that had the new museum as a reference, not only artistically, but also ethically. Her motto was, act first, think later, so you have something to think about. And that still is part of my ethos. And the new museum at that moment was a very lively place, a place where maybe the importance was not what was happening in the galleries. Of course it was, but everything else. We all had to sit at the front desk at least, 3 hours per day, just to welcome people and to understand the important role of a museum at that moment. So she was extremely generous, as I was saying, with a whole generation, and in a way that I think that in a point of no return for many of us. If you haven't read her memoirs, I think it's a must for every curator. Her memoirs are called A Short Light of Travel, 40 Years in the New York Art World. I think it's worth. And the project that we did, and I was an unpaid intern, as I was saying, she was asked to curate a show at the White House in Washington, D.C. And she was very quick saying when she got offered that, obviously it was a great honor for her, said, okay, I need an assistant. I need you to pay my assistant. So that's the other image, yeah? Because that project happened 2 years later. I coordinated that project. I researched for that project. And finally, it took place in Washington, D.C., and that was when Hillary Rodham Clinton was the first lady. I don't think such a project would be possible now. But at the moment, it was really, really a great Imagine how you are incubated in such a circumstance. And I have to say, my whole itinerary was also in depth with many generous women that understood the role of the institutions. From there, I went to the Fundació Joan Miró in Barcelona, where I curated many shows under the leadership of the director, Rosa Maria Malet, and many others like Maria de Corral, also, that was extremely generous with my generation, supporting us and understanding that these generational links have to be treated with lots of care and offer spaces of visibility and action. I always tried to reproduce that. Maybe not as well as they did, because they were extremely good. And I think that institutions need to understand themselves as incubators, but obviously not only of individuals, but of attitudes. So many times when we think of institutions, we think of what they do. As if the what is the most important thing, and it's true, obviously. What museums have in their collections, the exhibitions that museums do are crucial, because that's what the audience will enjoy. But even more important is the how. How you are. And the how is in the details, and every single element is there. And how are you greeted? How texts are written? How we establish a relationship, a fruitful relationship with artists, with all the artistic agents, and how that can be part of the institution itself. Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was chatting with you before this in the discussions we were having before today's panel, and you told me, today whenever I sit in my chair and I'm confronted with something, I think, what would Marsha Tucker have done? And I thought that was so telling of what an impact someone has in your life. Azu, I thought let's move now beyond the formal spaces, actually, to alternate platforms. And oftentimes it is individuals with great drive and passion who are able to create these platforms that nurture, that train, that grow the spaces in the arts and for the growth of arts and as well as the creator of arts. And that's what you've done with the African Arts Foundation in Lagos. And clearly something is working because we can see the next generation emerging as well. And I remember at Venice, the two pavilions that were really talked about was the Benin Pavilion, which Azu curated, and the Nigerian Pavilion, which the young Andrea Emalai curated. So what are the infrastructures that are gradually developing over the continent, and what role are institutions playing in this?
Thank you so much. I'd like to echo my thanks to Charles and the entire team for doing such a wonderful job bringing us all together and organizing this wonderful talks program. Thank you so much. I'd just like to also echo a few sentiments that my colleagues on the panel have shared about generosity, and I think that's a very big part of the job that we do as curators, museum personnel, and thinkers in this space. I think there's a generosity that is vital to the sustainability of everything that we're thinking of and doing. Within the context of my work, my recent work, I launched a project called Dig Where You Stand, and the idea was to think about the institutions on the continent and how we're constantly competing for the same limited resources in how we survive and how we present work and how we develop the infrastructure that we need. And the infrastructure that we need is not just the physical, but it's also, more importantly, the intellectual infrastructure to make it work. And so the idea of the project was really to connect institutions through, again, the pedagogy of doing, the direct mode of engagement and learning by actually handing out this toolkit that I sort of developed as a concept to young curators who've never curated an exhibition before, and to travel across the 26 coastal regions that border Africa with its various diasporas, because I thought, I was frustrated with the connection that Africans have with our diasporic brethren. And it was always through something called Afrofuturism and this sort of future imaginary that we've all seen 100 shows about Afrofuturism. And it's wonderful, but I think it almost suspends the agency that we have in the present to build and to nurture ideas. And so the concept was really to think about the biggest conversations that we're having in the contemporary art world. It's always restitution, repatriation, decolonization. And how do you create a dish, put all of these in a box, and design a toolkit that allow young curators, young thinkers, young artists to get their feet wet, to curate their first exhibition. So we launched it in Ghana at Ibrahim Maham's space called SCCA Tamale, and it now travels from Tamale to Togo, to a space called Palais Lomé. And the curator that we appointed to curate the next iteration in Lomé, again, never curated a show. S&M Delamali, working with Ibrahim, she curated the iteration in Lomé. And then after the war had in Lomé, we got a curator to curate the next iteration that happened in Benin. And it continues like that. So by the time we're done, we're connecting with Africa and its diaspora through exhibition making and through nurturing a new generation of curators and thinkers. But very significantly, it's also a way of thinking about the diaspora, because, there are 26 coastal regions that have what colonialists call the point of no return. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to return, we're trying to bring back, the spirit, the intelligence, the knowledge, all of those remarkable ideas, the survival of our brethren in diaspora in the U.S. I mean, the current research that we're doing in Abidjan, which is our next destination, really focuses on the work of Basquiat and how he came to Abidjan in 1986 and spent a wonderful time there, and found that his work had a deep resonance with the work that local artists and painters and thinkers were making at the time. And so, using that as a way of thinking about the current rather than the future, becomes a very powerful toolkit to begin to sharpen the edges and to build.
Yeah, thank you for emphasizing the importance of that generosity that so many of us have benefited from, the people who went ahead of us and whom we have learned so much from. Naomi, if I can come back to you to look at the different roles that museums are called on to play today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the museum's role as a site of protest, of social activism. And I remember your exhibition also, 30 seconds of an inch. Yes, and it actually invited viewers to look at the social meaning that was embedded in artworks. So the museum realized its social role very early on. So why don't you...
I did realize the question of the social very early on, and 30 Seconds Off an Inch was at the Studio Museum. But it's funny you should mention then this question of a museum as a site as protest, because I've been thinking a lot about that. As in the US, there have been just an ongoing, rolling series of protests in museums, especially since 2020, which was, of course, the height of the Black Lives Matter movement on the streets in the US, especially after the murder of George Floyd. So within that context, you have this very public sort of dissatisfaction played out in museums, which I think is interesting. It happens in museums as much as it does in the streets and against the government. But you also have a nervousness inside of museums around presenting political content. And so now you see images of an exhibition that we recently had at the Guggenheim Museum with Jenny Holzer's work. And there's been a series of these works scrolling around. Jenny Holzer is an artist whose career started on the streets of New York. She started making graffiti. She started wheat pasting text on the streets of downtown New York, and texts that were called truisms, which were her kind of cliches and pithy statements around life, living, consumption, politics, what it means to live in a community. But Jenny, of course, is most concerned right now with the series of violent wars that have been happening really since the 90s, starting with the Balkan Wars, clearly thinking about what's happening in the Middle East right now. And all that context was coming into her exhibition, including artworks that were very much about the current president, who was not the president at the time, but of course had a prior stint in the White House. And so there was all this work directly referencing his time there, and it wasn't kind to him. Let's put it that way. And so the question for us was, A, how do we sort of frame this as an institution? Because we cannot take sides. B, if someone comes and has an issue with any of this material, especially, for instance, the work you see right now, which is specifically about war, and everyone interpreted this as being a response to Gaza, and it wasn't exactly, but that was top of mind. And thirdly, in a moment right now where there are so many protests and literally violence happening in museums. I mean, literally people are getting punched in the face inside museums. How do we protect our colleagues and staff? And so this became a really interesting exercise for us at the museum. We had to develop a series of what we're calling first principles. And this was an exercise that I went through with my board, all the way down to all the trustees, to the security staff, where we basically made a set of rules of behavior. And one of the first ones was, we will not censor artists. We cannot. We have the kind of ability, at least in the US now, to not be in trouble for the content that an artist puts out, and we are going to stand by that content, even if we personally don't agree with it. And we don't have to. But it is the artist's voice. And the second thing that we realized that we had to do was not take sides. We had to make that very clear also to our colleagues who are all citizens and have their own political positions. So you're allowed to have your political opinion as an employee, but the museum is not the platform for your politics, personally. So we had to make that clear to everyone as well. And then we also made it very clear that we would protect our staff, and here they are now looking at the last solar eclipse, I think April 2 years ago, that we were going to make sure to keep them out of harm's way. We also opened the door to protest. We decided to not call the police immediately. We decided to not block people from coming in. We know we have a beautiful, photogenic building. People love it for staging protests. And so we said, let it happen. Let it happen. Don't stop them. We will only call the police if people are there after opening hours. And so we have had protests in the building, interestingly enough, not about the content of what's on the walls, but about climate action mostly. Of course, we were famous for our protests around the opioid drug crisis. And all those things have been peaceful. The protesters have been kind. They've even called us ahead of time to let us know they're coming in some cases. Because I think what the world is craving is sites for public discourse. And it is the museum, at least in the United States, that has become the commons in a way that many other, let's say, political sites, governmental sites, are not allowed for open and public discourse anymore. And so we realized we had to allow that to happen. And we still hope for the best. You know, we don't know if something else may change. But we do understand right now that our responsibility is to allow for open discourse as much as possible.
I love that idea of the museum as a site for public discourse, and also the challenge that we as museum professionals face. You do have a point of view. How do you keep that in the private space and make sure it doesn't affect and influence your work as a museum professional in the work that you do in relation to the public? So, Ferran, coming to you, how do we make sure that the narratives of the North do not become or remain the narratives of the South?
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, and I think the dream that the museum could be an agent for decolonization, it's a trick, because it will trap us in trying to convert the museum that was built as a place where power structures are visible and sometimes defended. I could link with what you were saying. Maybe the key is try to challenge them from within the museum. But in any case, going to that question, I think that, all these attempts of decolonizing are a bit tricky. Maybe what the museum can do, and we do very well, is do a catalog of post-colonial attitudes that will help us generate decolonial structures and attitudes. But the museum as a decolonial agent is extremely difficult. Here, we're here in the audience is Shuda, who is a member of Rax Media Collective. We did a project 12 years ago in Madrid, a beautiful project that then traveled to Latin America. And the great question there was how to be cosmopolitan without being colonized. And I could say, how to be cosmopolitan without being a colonizer also. And I think that that's our question. It has been, at least in the last 20 years. Try to understand that there are many ways of acting, defying colonial structures, and opening new ways of operating.
I know it's a bit contradictory to expect the museum to be agents of decolonization, when in fact a lot of the practices and for some encyclopedic museums, the very collections reflect colonial practices. Yeah. So, Tasneem, coming to you. Yeah, I remember in my earlier role at MAP, we were really looking at fresh narratives that moved away from the colonial histories that we inherited. And I know you've done a lot of work on rewriting histories, on repositioning traditional arts, so that we create a new appreciation that reflects more contemporary thinking. Would you like to talk us through that?
Yes. So I want to go back to what both Naomi and Ferran have said, that it is a pedagogy of practice. I think that's very important, what you say. And yours, a catalogue of attitudes. I like that. That's a very nice phrase. So we, of course, inherited a colonial museum, a colonial institution. And that's the reason that it was lying in a derelict condition. So even though we completely restored it, etc., how were we now going to present it to the public? How were we going to engage the public imagination? And I felt very strongly that it, and of course, in the context of recent research, that we needed to interrogate the structures of how these museums were set up. They're very much, institutions set up during the colonial period, and what were the attitudes and the politics as well of the colonials, which all the objects that we have in the museum reflect that kind of politics and the intentions of the colonial period. So the idea was not to be didactic about it, not to sort of say, well, this is what was done, and actually this is the politics of it, etc., but was to invite artists and ask them to really question and interrogate. You're, in a sense, asking the artist to be the activist, to be the protester, in a sense. But you're doing it in a very subtle way, because we are a government museum, and we have to be very conscious of how we say what we say. So we have to fly below the radar. So we do say a lot of stuff, but you have to read between the lines. Sometimes we have a show of the artist Rina Kalat, who is here with us this evening, a fantastic show we've just opened about a week back. It's a survey solo, a sort of mini retrospective. And there are parts of it which could be construed, if you wanted to be suggesting certain a certain type of politics. But really, in a sense, at the end of the day, what is the politics that the museums are espousing? It's what you said. It's a politics of humanity. And so that's exactly what we hope will sort of come through. You are trying to speak the truth. You are putting a lot of facts on the table. You are, in a sense, lifting the veil. But, and getting people to question what happens in India, because we don't really have museums in India that show contemporary art. Where are the museums? There is Kiran Nadar, and there's MAP, and there's the Bhau Daji Lad Museum. Very few museums, maybe one or two in Ahmedabad, and there's one in Patna that occasionally does the shows. But there isn't that kind of audience engagement to get people to question and think. So the intention from 2008 when we opened, and we've had many contemporary artists come in and interrogate the collection, was in fact to get people to ask the questions, not to spoon feed them. So yeah, you can see, yes, that is Jitish Kalat's wonderful exhibition. Jitish is also here in the audience. And that is the statue of Albert. And he very subtly references not only the remaking of the museum, and in a sense the repositioning of the museum, but also the city, which is constantly reinventing itself. And if you see, this is not actual scaffolding. These are bamboos made with resin that have gargoyles that reference the whole colonial history. And the gargoyles are very suggestive. They look a little bit like monsters. So there are many innuendos in there. But there are several artists have had exhibitions, and so the idea is exactly this, that even the exhibitions and writing the texts and is a form of, developing a pedagogy and a training. You're developing an attitude, exactly as Ferran said, and you're helping these young people who have not been educated in this sort of knowledge to begin to learn about it, understand it, and engage with it, and hopefully, go on to believe and practice it. Yeah.
Thank you, Tasneem. Azu, what role do you see for the arts in ensuring that we stay connected with current developments, and how do we as museum people who work in the museum space understand the power of collaborative practice? Because if we are to survive and to thrive, that's clearly the way forward.
Thank you. The sentiments Ferran shared about the attitude, is super accurate. I think the praxis of decolonization, for example, we're really truly living in a world that is, reinventing itself completely. And artists are really at the forefront of this conversation. They are really out there thinking about these problems. And so, I've worked in ethnographic museums where you're dealing with problematic collections. I've worked in museums that have anthropomorphic photographs, and people ask me, what do we do with this? Should we throw them out? Should we burn them? Should we destroy them, or whatever it is? And I think, we really truly underestimate the intelligence and the ability for artists to think dialectically, to think within contradictions. And that's what my practice is really about, trusting the artist to move beyond the theory of decolonization or the theory of radical remediation into a form of reimagining what the possibilities are within complex histories. And so, collaborative thinking, collaborative work, being transparent about, your approach. Also, really thinking about, it is true that the museum of the 20th century is unwieldy. It's almost impossible to change. It doesn't really want to change. But there are new museums, being built in the Middle East, in Africa, in India. There are many contemporary art museums. But the idea of thinking about, I love what's going on in XYZ Museum in New York and I want to recreate that is an abomination. I think that's a big problem. Thinking about the past, thinking about, holding that lodestar and thinking that that's the gold standard, that is dead in the water. And those unwieldy museums are desperately trying to change, but they don't know how. And so, for majority world people, my activism and my work is really about saying, let us think about what we can do collaboratively, to reimagine the Museum of the 21st Century as a site for radical gestures, both for healing, for coming together, to show the world that we really believe in the idea of a common humanity, not a narcissistic approach to, supremacy or any of those ideas that we're constantly trying to navigate and dodge and shed and, little landmines everywhere. So really thinking about how we can work collaboratively, connecting the dots, the majority world people, all of those brilliant ideas that were sabotaged in the 60s, the 70s, realigning those ideas and not thinking that we're so smart and we're inventing anything. There is a lot in the archives. You only need to go back there to troll through history and reconnect, find those networks that our ancestors, thought about. Let's make them happen and then use that as a way to build for the future.
Do you want to talk a bit about maybe one of the collaborative practices that you've done, for example, with Ibrahim in Ghana, so that people can get an idea of what's been done?
We're thinking through an idea called the non-aligned movement. It's actually registered in London, problematically, but very significantly. So thinking about these histories, about how Muhammad Space is in Tamale, it's not Accra, it's not sort of like the hip spot in Ghana, but it's an hour on a flight from Accra, but it's a really wonderful space. It's got schools around it. There's a school right next door to it. It's got incredible foot traffic since it opened. And so he and I thought about how we can really circulate the artists on the continent who are celebrated all over the world, but to get their work to circulate in Africa. I don't want to go to have to go to Paris to see the work of Zanelli Muholi or to go to London to see the work of Mahama. It has to work. These works were produced by the conditions on the continent, right? And how is it that people on the continent are not able to engage with those narratives, in the first instance? So the generosity of approach of thinking about how we can share and how we can connect these objects and share stories is really what we launched with Dig Where You Stand. And as you can imagine, you might have seen a huge sculpture by Zanelli. So what we've just done is to find a way to get around the problem of shipping, for example, and not necessarily ship these objects. So, we ship a big sculpture by Zanelli to Tamale, and Zanelli makes a donation of the work, and Mahama makes a donation of the work to the project, so it's circulated. So we're always finding ways to take a side road to making these connections possible. And that starts with a generosity of approach. That starts with understanding the concept that we're working with. That also starts with really buying into the idea and thinking about how do we prioritize the local audience? How do we not look to the West for energy all the time, to think about how we can really build those frameworks on the continent? And it's really working quite well.
I know collaborative practice can really make for so much of sustainable development, but that's another conversation. But I was quite amused by the idea of museums taking the Western model and implanting them in different other spaces where they're not necessarily relevant, because when we were building a new museum, we were constantly thinking of how do we get people into our into the museum, and how do we build this museum-going culture. And I remember one of my friends in the art space, he laughed and he said, "But why would Indians want to go into a museum? Art is such a part of their lives. They see it on their walls. They're doing it. It's on their doorsteps. Art is created in every aspect of their lives. They are used to engaging with it in a daily way. They go and watch a show in the field, for example, if any a puppet show is done or whatever. That's part of their all-nighters. Why would they think of the museum as a space to come in to experience culture? So I think we have to think of different contexts and different situations when we want to create models. So Naomi, the festivals also are such an important part of the art ecosystem, and congratulations on being the new artistic director for the Documenta 2027. I was curious to understand what is your reimagining of the 27 iteration of the festival or the Biennale really, and how can we move beyond the conflict of what we saw in 2022 and to see a Biennale as a site of something that challenges and provokes, but for positive outcomes?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the congratulatory note. If you don't mind, I'm going to defer that question. Because it is early days yet. I've only just been announced, and I'm literally starting and getting past literally in the earliest stages of pulling together my team, consolidating ideas, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing I would say to that in particular is that, how do we get past 2022? We have no choice. Right? I think 2022 was a moment where the content became an issue, obviously, but I also think the response was an issue. It was clear that Documenta was not prepared to respond to that. And we also see a changing sort of political status in Germany. It's a very different situation in 2022 than it was in 1992 or even in 1952 when Documenta was founded. And I think we're all going to work to make sure that I, as artistic director, the management team of Documenta, but also my curators and artists are all well aware of the context in which we are working and walking in. I think that is the most important thing. Understand your context, and I think I've been hearing this from everyone on the stage. Understand your social and political context. Understand your ethical position vis-a-vis that context and when and where you are going to enter. And understand the work that you can do in that moment without putting other people in harm's way. If you want to put yourself in harm's way, do it. I do believe in that. But make sure that you are respectful of other people and their space as well.
Okay, so we've had a very structured conversation so far, so I thought now let's leave it open to everyone to give their final thoughts. And who would like to go first? Azu, would you like to go first?
I just have one quick thought, actually, in response to something Ferran had said in your work with the Rocks Media Collective, and really thinking about this question of cosmopolitanism, which I think in your framing, you're imagining what does it mean to be a subject that can move around the world. And I've often been thinking about that very same question. Obviously, it is one that's been constitutive of my practice thus far, will be part of my practice with Documenta. But I've also been really interested in a statement that Kwame Anthony Appiah wrote. This is a British-born writer, philosopher, ethicist, now living in New York. He said, he wrote a book on cosmopolitanism. And one of the ways in which he frames it is not as so much about being the subject that moves around the world, but about being the host. And it is, in his estimation, cosmopolitanism is, I think he calls it kindness to strangers. And I think that's a beautiful kind of distillation of the idea of what it means to be a global citizen. It is about opening your arms, home, resources, minds to the ways in which another person is also moving around the world and may need a home at the moment they encounter you.
I couldn't agree more that the big question is not how to be cosmopolitan, each one of us, in terms of what happens here, that maybe we have flown from other places to be here today, but we will be someplace else. But that's not the key. The key is how to create a cosmopolitan world where the differences are not only ruled by those rules set in the colonial times. And in that sense, the museum can play a very important role. And I would say the Museum of Contemporary Art even more, because we're talking about museums and displaying as pieces and works that maybe never wanted to get into a museum. But the great thing that the Museum of Contemporary Art has and can, serve also as a reference to other ways of operating, is that we have works that do want to be museums. It's the only museum that works in that direction. All the rest is violence in one way or another. It's the only museum that will have an object that was thought, the person who did it thought, I wish one day this will end in a museum. So let's take, we can take a benefit from that the violence that the Museum of Contemporary Art exercises is a bit different.
Well, the landscape for us is very different. I would just say what you say is so important about you framed it so beautifully, the idea of cosmopolitanism and what Kwame Appiah has said. And I think that is really, for us, in museums, in India, that is the struggle. And I hope that many, many more museums will address this issue in India, because we don't have, as you know, Kamini, we don't have a museum going public. And I think that for us is a major issue, is to bring the people, engage the people, and then, sort of co-opt them into this way of thinking. But I also have to say that we have these books that we put out for exhibitions, the contemporary exhibitions, as well as the response to the museum. And people, the government at least, and doesn't regard contemporary art because they think it's not of interest to the general public. But it's one of those incredible things that if you read our visitor comment book, they love the contemporary art They get it. It's not as if they don't. And they want to be a part of this conversation. It is, in fact, on the part of governments or even on the part of, the officials or lots of people who think that this is beyond them, and I'm talking particularly for an Indian context, that in fact it's something that they really want to engage with and be a part of the conversation. So my great hope is that there will be many more platforms, and for people, like you say, who would like to be in a museum, there are very few at the moment in India. So I think that is when things will really begin to shift.
I'd just like to emphasize the idea of hosting, and I think hosting is such a powerful medium or tool to really bring the conversation together. I believe that the art world over the last decade has struggled with having the opportunity to host different views, divergent opinions, and I think that especially within the context of new art spaces, there is an etiquette of hosting or being a guest, and the idea of offering that platform in different world scenarios, whether it's in the Middle East or in India or in Africa, really allows you to present and to show what the possibilities are for a common humanity, which is the very essence of the work that we do as curators, as museologists, as thinkers. And so, I really, really want to emphasize that point and to thank Naomi for that great idea, because it's really fundamental to what museums are: sites for healing, sites for knowledge, sites for education, and all of the things that museums are really fabulous at doing. So thank you.
I want to say thank you to Naomi, Tasneem, Ferran, Azu, and I thank you all for listening. Thank you.